a.m. and we are resuming our work on H1 through 6, an act relating to community resilience and biodiversity protection. We had a brief bill introduction and some initial testimony last week, but today we're really going to do a much deeper dive, and just want to thank all the parties who are here today to help us understand the bill and the issues and opportunities underlying. So with that, we will pause. And good morning, Secretary Moore. Good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Cool laptop.
Yeah, I know. I feel
Is that the state laptop?
it is a state
That's
issued
cool.
laptop. I know
Should
I
get some of those.
rarely turn it on its side, but it's convenient to be able to do that.
I would love that. That would be great.
Yeah.
So for the record, Julie Moran, the Secretary of Natural Resources, thank you for inviting me to be here this morning to talk a little bit about H126. I am joined by two of my colleagues who I know are on down your agenda, John Austin, who is the Lands and Habitat Program Manager with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and next to him is Becca Washburn, who's the Director of Lands Administration and Recreation within Forest Parks and Recreation. And those two departments within A&R are responsible to the lion's share, I guess I should say, of our land conservation activities. As your committee may be aware, A&R holds and stewards about 360,000 acres of public lands to the benefit of Vermonters.
Great. Mr. Austin, are you related to the Austins of Brattleboro, Vermont?
Not that I'm aware of.
Check.
There's a lot of Austins around.
Yeah, it's my middle name. My mom made me. All right. Anyway, onward and upward. Small state.
It is a small state.
It's either an opportunity or a danger that you could be related to pretty much anything. All right.
But I say that by way of just making clear, conservation is a core component of the agency's work. And the importance of a resilient and connected landscape is the foundational driver of our conservation work. So my intention is to essentially do a bit of stage setting this morning with some brief remarks, both on what I see as the areas of alignment and then some incongruencies between what's envisioned by H126 as currently drafted and some of these existing agency-led efforts. And then we'll turn things over to John and Becca, who can speak much more meaningfully to our conservation work. So as I expect you know, the goals of H126 are really intended to parallel the 2021 federal call to action made by the Biden-Harris administration that is sometimes referred to as America the Beautiful, which seeks to conserve, connect, and restore lands, waters, and wildlife upon which we all depend. And so those key principles that were identified by the White House to guide that conservation effort include things like pursuing a collaborative and inclusive approach to conservation, supporting voluntary stewardship efforts for private landowners, using science as a guide, and building on existing tools and strategies with an emphasis on flexibility and adaptive approaches. America the Beautiful is intentionally broad in defining what counts as progress towards conservation and recognizing that debates over the value of different types of protection take away from the important work needed to protect biodiversity and support climate resilience. H126 is currently drafted is significantly more narrow than America the Beautiful, with a near exclusive focus on permanent protection. And this narrowing was a significant factor in the governor's veto of similar legislation last session. Conservation comes in many forms, as you'll hear from John and Becca, and it's very important that we think broadly about the full range of conservation options. Approximately 80% of Vermont's landscape is privately owned, and so this work with private landowners is critical to ensuring ecological function and a landscape that is resilient in the face of a changing climate. Land acquisition and legal protection are a really important one, but only one tool or practice towards achieving that goal. We need flexibility to meet landowners where they are, to be able to pair the right tool and the right level of conservation, and to ensure the best resources have the highest degree of protection possible. Put another way, a range of conservation tools is essential to our overarching goal, that is ensuring an ecologically functional, resilient, and connected landscape. And so I'm concerned that focusing exclusively on permanent conservation and numeric conservation goals shifts that focus away from the quality of the resources we are working to protect to focus on quantity. There's perhaps no better illustration of our focus on an ecologically functional landscape than the significant investment the agency has made in developing and now using Vermont conservation design. Bob Zano, I know, isn't on your agenda thus far, but he's really our spokesperson for Vermont Conservation Design and technical lead. And Vermont Conservation Design provides information about the places that are most ecologically rich, serve as important connectors or pinch points for movements of animals and other wildlife across the landscape, areas that are most rare or imperiled. But this information alone cannot be the sole guide or measure of success for how lands and waters are protected, conserved, or restored. Vermont Conservation Design sets science-based, quantitative, and distributional goals for maintaining and restoring an ecologically functional landscape, but it doesn't necessarily prescribe specific parcels, and it provides a scientific benchmark for long-term conservation success in the state by identifying high priority features for conservation. That said, it does not identify specific tools or pathways to achieve that conservation, as it recognizes there are many strategies for conserving ecological function, but rather provides a framework for ecological value. Vermont Conservation Design is a science-based tool that we use to inform our conservation efforts, from our engagement around land use planning, technical assistance that the state provides directly to private landowners, and decisions regarding forest and habitat fragmentation and connectivity that we take in regulatory processes along with our own conservation work.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry, I missed the name of the person you're recommending if we want to follow up.
Bob Zano, Z-A-I-N-O.
That's not how I. Great, thanks.
You're welcome. And just would say conservation in all its forms is important if we are to achieve the targets of Vermont Conservation Design, and again, ties back to that ecologically functional, resilient and connected landscape. So just a few pieces specific to the bill. H126 would establish 3 types of areas that meet the conservation purposes of the bill. Ecological reserve areas, for which the poster child is presumably old growth forests, but also includes other vulnerable parts of our landscape. Biodiversity conservation areas, which are really focused on core habitats and the highest priority natural communities, and natural resource management areas that are intended to be available for sustainable forest management. This definition in particular excludes important conservation investments the state has and continues to make in agricultural lands. And I'm a firm believer that well-managed agricultural lands play important roles in an ecologically connected landscape, and also Vermont's food security, and should absolutely be part of this effort. The emphasis on permanent conservation in all 3 of these definitions I also see as unnecessarily limiting. Although the proposed findings of the bill recognize that a full range of conservation approaches is needed, including supporting private landowners, conservation easements that promote sustainable forest management, and fee acquisitions focused on passive management, the planning effort envisioned in H126 that would be undertaken by the agency and partners in response to the bill is directed to rely almost exclusively on permanent conservation. And while the bill directs that the plan review the conservation categories and suggest possible modifications or additions, presumably any such recommendations would require further legislative action, making unclear how those changes could be incorporated into the planning effort. As you'll hear from John and Becca, while permanent conservation is an important tool, it really is far from our only tool. The agency buys and owns land for many reasons beyond natural features, including public access, public benefit, outdoor recreation, social well-being, as well as raw materials, goods, and services. And the agency considers a full range of land values in deciding how and for what purposes land is to be managed. The conservation value of a particular place should not be measured solely in biological terms, but should also take into account the meaningful benefit it can have for the lives of all Vermonters. And we need to make sure these benefits are distributed equitably. It should help also local communities achieve their own conservation priorities and visions. I also want to emphasize the important role of voluntary stewardship of private lands plays in our overall mission and work. As I noted, about 80% of Vermont is in private ownership. And what we really need is thoughtful management and stewardship by those landowners in order to achieve our landscape scale conservation goals. And we have a variety of programs that help support landowners in thoughtful stewardship, and I think are integral to developing a conservation vision for the state. Finally, just to touch a little bit on what I see as the resources required to implement the vision of H126. I would offer that ANR has the expertise, the experience, and frankly, the legal responsibility to address the fundamental interests expressed in the bill. That is for the conservation of land, water, plants, and animals in all their form. And we are actively participating in the VHCB-led conservation planning effort that is currently underway. And I know Trey is going to speak to a bit further into your agenda this morning. H126 appropriately ascribes significant responsibilities for the development and implementation of the conservation plan to ANR, but currently does not provide any resources to the agency to support this work. I look at the agency as the most enduring organization in terms of the long-term success of the interests that are articulated in the bill. ANR will always be acquiring interest in land and managing the land that we own. We will always support applied on-the-ground conservation programs, such as the use value appraisal program to the benefit of Vermont's environments. And while programs and priorities within the agency may shift somewhat over time to adjust and adapt to current priorities and conditions on the ground, fundamentally, this is the work of ANR. There are no other organizations or parts of state government that provide this assurance of long-term durable commitments to land conservation and stewardship. So for this work to be successful at the scale that is envisioned, it is essential for the agency to be resourced appropriately, both for this planning effort and ultimately implementation of the plan. And the magnitude and the pace of the conservation work envisioned by this bill is likely to require tens of millions of dollars a year to support both acquisition and ownership. And this is a point that I don't see has had any discussion thus far. So just in closing, want to reiterate, conservation really is a core component of the agency's work. And while 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 conservation goals are useful slogans and provide direction, successful conservation is not only about the quantity of the land conserved, but must consider the quality, and that is driven by science. The agency has been and remains committed to playing a leading role in conservation initiatives in Vermont. And I'm happy to either answer questions or simply turn things over to John and Becca to talk more about this work. I'd only note I do have to step out about 9:30. So if you have questions for me, they may be best now.
Sure, I have a couple. Senator White.
You're welcome to start if you want. I'm happy to wait.
So thank you for the, I'll start on the tail end and go back.
Sure.
So resources, when we're talking about resources, what sort of in plain language, what do we have here and what do we not have that you would need in order to be able to support such a program?
Sure. So absolutely have appreciated the resources that VHCB is bringing to bear in the planning effort that's currently underway. I would also just reflect that ANR is at capacity right now. The federal funds in particular that we're charged with administering are challenging us and stretching us. And so my feeling is we would need resources for an FTE for sort of the 3-year period of work envisioned by this bill, just to provide capacity within the agency to support the planning effort. The question about the ongoing cost of land acquisition and stewardship, I think is something that should be taken up and contemplated as part of the planning effort. But I think it's a point that sort of isn't really talked about right now. And just would offer that we're meeting our current stewardship obligations for the 360,000 acres we currently own in fee is a challenge that we routinely confront. And any dramatic addition to that portfolio would absolutely require additional capacity.
Yes, stewardship, I mean, land conservation, so correct me if I have a misimpression, but it seems like it's a little like buying a horse. Buying a horse is the first expense. And then the stewardship's like taking care of that horse.
Correct.
And it's more expensive than you might have thought when you bought the horse.
Yes. That is an apt analogy.
So
So we need to look.
75,000 for to VHCB. Can you, we don't need it now, but it would be helpful because this week be drafting a letter now to send to Approach to talk about needs for the coming year. And if you can quantify what you're looking, what you would need to support the bill, that would be helpful.
Yes.
Okay.
Do you want it limited just to the current year, or, I mean, this is
I think-
an ongoing challenge,
Yeah.
right? Is there's multiple years worth of work envisioned by this bill?
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful to everyone to see a bigger picture as well as just to know what the next year's request, and are we talking about, it doesn't sound like one time, it sounds like base budget, all that kind of stuff, so.
Yes, we can put that together for you.
And then I'm sure appropriations will have their own interesting questions.
Yes.
Certainly.
Thank you, Chair Bright. And that was going to be my question as well, was what were the resources that you envision needing to actually implement this? And you had noted tens of millions of dollars each year to implement. So I do think that that's the longer term question. So I appreciate that we might have that question resolved so we can get some good numbers to understand what that would look like for you or for the agency. And then my other larger question is, I didn't quite hear in your testimony why biodiversity and conservation might be beneficial generally. And I was surprised by that because I think as the Secretary of ANR, I'm sure you see the reasoning behind why we are moving forward and pushing this. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to why conservation is something that your agency does now in general, and why this is kind of the stopping point. Because I asked that question because I hear from constituents constantly that when private land ownership exists, it doesn't allow working Vermonters or low-income Vermonters to have the benefits of these places. And it sounded like you're at a place where you think we have enough. And I'd love to hear if you could describe what the benefits Vermonters are getting now and why we can't push forward on these.
Sure. I don't want to leave you with the impression that there is any intention, present or absent, the passage of H126 to change our ongoing commitment to continuing to conserve land.
Thank you.
And access and accessibility is absolutely one of the aspects we look at in considering different land acquisition projects and frankly, investments we're making in existing land holdings, whether it's creating ADA compliant paths or ADA accessible docks. We're looking for ways to expand opportunities for Vermonters of different abilities to use our lands, and then also are regularly looking at the geographic distribution of our land holdings to try to ensure there are public lands available to the public throughout Vermont. There are gaps in where our land holdings currently are, and that's one of those criteria. But appreciating that one of the intrinsic values of public lands beyond biodiversity and some of the natural resources values is really those public benefits that Vermonters and our visitors can enjoy by being able to take advantage of what public lands have to offer. I think also Vermont has a really robust history of private landowners granting access to the public, whether it's the Bass Trail, other hiking trails and resources. And some of that is part of this larger conversation and dialogue too.
And just one more. Are you concerned at all with the increased extinction rate of almost all species in our state? And
Yes.
I'm personally very concerned about that, both as a Vermonter who has grown up here and has already seen species die off. And when you look at the rate of species die off, it's frightening. And it means that in my lifetime, there's a chance that the majority of creatures that exist now will not be in existence when I'm in my 40s or 50s. Does that concern you? And do you feel that we're doing enough?
Yeah, I think that concern is one of the factors that led to the development of Vermont conservation design. I think historically the agency took a sort of species by species approach to conservation and recognized that that is not our most effective strategy for being protective of biodiversity. It's instead thinking about creating a range of different ecological settings on the, or protecting a range of different ecological settings on the landscape, and then ensuring there's connectivity between them so that wildlife, and to a lesser degree plants, is able to migrate and move between these critical habitat areas. And I think you would be very interested in the work of Vermont Conservation Design and how that intersects exactly with our emphasis on protecting biodiversity.
And do you have information that shows how this plan will prevent that catastrophe of continued die-off within the different species that we know are currently under threat?
By this plan, you mean Vermont Conservation Design?
Because what I'm trying to understand in comparison to the bill is, your point is, we're doing enough now, we don't need to go further because we need.
I don't think that, I wouldn't say that that was
Okay.
my point.
Okay,
I think my point is, you're doing really good and important work now, that this bill is very focused on quantity goals. And what I would argue is, we believe we need a diversity of tools that allows us to focus on quality goals. And
Okay.
quality is something that is, in our work, largely informed by Vermont Conservation Design.
okay, so can you just describe, and I apologize, can I just have one more question?
Please.
Quality,
Yes.
if you could just describe, is that a beautiful natural resource? Is that a criteria that you have? Is that something written out? What is quality to you?
So
Or to the agency?
sure, it is looking at the ecological values of different types of habitats. And there are a range of different, and I'm gonna get out way over my skis, and John is probably best positioned to talk about this. But there are a range of different habitat types that then in turn support a diversity of plant and animal communities. And so it's making sure that we have enough of each of the different types of habitat to create opportunities for all species to thrive.
Okay, thank you.
A couple of questions. So the people have been referring to the national legislation, whose name eludes me at the moment.
America the Beautiful?
Thank you.
Yes.
I shouldn't forget that one. Is that aspirational, or legally binding?
It's aspirational, it's a goal.
And so well, let me kind of edit the questions down. You also mentioned permanent versus non-permanent.
Yeah.
So can you say a little more about what that, as a toolkit to have? Can you say a little more? Because remember last year we were talking about conservation pathways, things like that, or a ladder.
Yes, we sometimes talk about conservation toolbox or conservation ladder. It includes things like the use value appraisal program, which isn't necessarily a permanent conservation strategy, but it provides some fairly significant barriers to people who wish to pull their lands out of conservation. So it doesn't make it easy if folks want to go a different route with a particular parcel. There are sometimes temporary easements that we are able to secure. A landowner may not be willing to either commit themselves long-term or their heirs to a particular management strategy for a piece of land, but is willing to do that in the current moment in time. So there are programs we administer, as well as our partners at NRCS and US Forest Service, that offer 10 or 15 or 20-year easements that again provide that degree of protection. And oftentimes those are places where, to the extent they stay undeveloped, it leaves open the opportunity for permanent conservation and ongoing dialogue and relationship building with these landowners.
Okay. Then agricultural lands. How's the agency that's trying to size up? How does the bill address agricultural lands in terms of their conservation value, and how does the agency?
So currently they don't count in H126. And I think, well-managed agricultural lands do have significant ecological values. Certainly there are often forested tracts, wetlands, streams, and other features that are contained within agricultural land holdings that aren't being managed actively for agriculture, but maybe part of a conserved farm that would have significant ecological value. And then there are also things like the work we're engaged in to ensure habitat for grassland breeding birds. Correct, and eastern meadowlarks. And that those are very much integral with agricultural operations, right? They require those grasslands. So there's going to be a bit of, it depends on the management strategy that's used for a particular agricultural piece. But I think in general, there are significant ecological values that either are or can be associated with agriculturally conserved lands. And we want to make sure that that's part of the conversation.
I know there's conversation coming on things aquatic. So I'm wondering if we could briefly say, my own question to myself is, what's the current legal status of waters of the state in terms of conservation? How are such waters treated in this bill? What's the current legal status of plants and animals living in the waters of the state? And are they protected in any way currently? And do they need more protection?
So
I know it's a big
yes, and I think there's sort of two pieces to it. One is the waters themselves are public trust, right? And we as ANR are responsible for stewarding them as a public trust resource. The Vermont Water Quality Standards, I would offer, are protective framework for ensuring that we protect the best and have in place requirements to restore the rest through the TMDL program and other strategies for addressing impaired waters. Also tying it back to Vermont conservation design. Vermont conservation design places a high emphasis on particularly riparian areas and also significant wetlands. And so that's already part and parcel of how we approach our conservation work and thinking about the needs of our surface water bodies and how to sustain them.
And sorry, a beginner question, how is the water, we're talking about ag land, is currently counted, is water currently counted? The space of our rivers, ponds and streams?
I don't believe surface water, like the acres of surface water, is currently part of how we are counting towards 30 by 30. But that said, H126 kind of, one of the initial charges of it is that inventory work. And so depending, I think, on the final scope, could or couldn't be added in. I think I have some concerns about sort of pulling water and riparian areas in particular out of this larger conservation conversation. I think we already place a high degree of emphasis on them through Vermont conservation design and sort of holding them as a distinct category. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I'm struggling with the value of that.
Okay, and so the Vermont Water Quality Standards address the plants and animals living in waters, riparian area.
Right, we're aiming for fishable, swimmable, drinkable waters.
Okay, Senator White and Senator McCormick, I see you up there now. I mean, Senator Watson.
Okay, no worries.
Look out for our cabaret skit tonight.
Yeah, I know.
You're not the only one.
I
It's okay.
know, even though I know exactly. who
I know. So I guess my question is to this point that we were just talking about, because I don't want to misunderstand. When we say that the waters of the state are held in public trust, when we say waters there, do we mean just the water, or do we mean the flora? Do we mean, like all the
Aquatic habitat.
Yeah.
So that is a component of what the Vermont Water Quality Standards are intended to protect, is not just the surface water, not just surface waters or groundwater for the sake of the resource, but also for the communities it supports.
Okay. And that includes marshlands.
Correct. So there's a little bit of a distinction in there. Wetlands certainly have their own set of protections that are provided for in statute. And then there is that intersection where you have wetlands that have open surface waters that are sort of subject to both sets of standards, both our wetlands rules as well as the water quality standards.
Thank you.
Senator McCormick. We can't hear you yet.
You're muted.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, you made the distinction between a qualitative approach and a quantitative approach. And I'm wondering if you could explain sort of where we're with feet on the ground, how they are in conflict, because it seems to me that we can pay attention to both criteria simultaneously.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that, Senator McCormick. And my concern that I'm attempting to highlight is if the goal ends up being conserving 50%, permanently conserving 50% of the Vermont landscape by 2050, and we are faced with two projects, one that would allow us to permanently conserve 100 acres of maybe less ecologically sensitive land, or a project that would allow us to provide durable yet not permanent protection for 100 acres of land. This bill would direct us, I believe, to pursue the 100 acres of permanent conservation. It gives disproportionate weight to permanent conservation over ecological value.
Like the old vaudeville joke of the woman complaining that the food at the restaurant was lousy and the portions were too small. The other is that when I talk about this with my constituents, there is in certain quarters of Windsor County, and I imagine all around the state, there's a presumption that preserving land is an economic loss because it's land that's not being worked profitably. And there's also that for that reason that there's a tax loss as well. And I have not been, I mean, I can give a kind of a philosophical answer, but I'm wondering what kind of real analysis there is of why this is an economic benefit.
Sure, the Trust for Public Land, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago now, but is that accurate? Conducted a study to answer that very question, Senator McCormick, and I'm happy to provide a link to that study, but also would encourage you to hear from Shelby Sims, who's the head of the Trust for Public Land, and I'm sure would welcome the opportunity to speak about their work. But generally, it shows that investments in conservation are good for the economy. And I think I've heard many of those same arguments and would just offer that the agency has a policy of not pursuing conservation projects without the support of the local elected officials, very much to give them an opportunity to share concerns and for us to make the case about why conservation is something that's good for their community in addition to good for the state as a whole.
Yeah, it is kind of a knee-jerk response almost that this is going to be bad for the economy.
Right. Yeah, the TVL report is very thoughtful and data rich, and frankly draws a lot from work done by the agency.
That's all for me.
Sorry, Senator McCormick, please.
No, I said that's all for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. One other quick thing I wanted to check in is in the findings, there's a rich set of resources cited. So there's a 2017 Forest Action Plan. There's Forest Future Strategic Roadmap. There's Vermont Climate Assessment. There's Vermont Climate Action Plan. There's the Resilient and Connected Landscape Project. And there's the Staying Connected Initiative. And this doesn't list actually, I think, the Vermont Conservation Design. So
No, it does.
maybe I just missed it in going through it. But at any rate, my point is that we have a lot of studies, a lot of projects, a lot of programs, and I'm trying to just make, it would be helpful for me to know if this is going to draw on those things and pull them together, or are we creating a sixth lane on the highway.
No, certainly the intention and the particularly the effort that VHCB is leading, that we're participating in, is an endeavor to pull all of those things together, not just to inform the agency's work, but the work of all the conservation partners that are out doing similar related and really important efforts across the landscape.
Thank you for saying this. I know we're a little past your.
You're welcome. I just need to be back up the hill by 10, so I still have plenty of time.
Oh,
Senator McDonald, you had a question. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yesterday, our operative question when we were dealing with renewables was the witnesses, what actions would you have us take? Thank you for your presentation on the value of environment, and et cetera. What actions would you have us take?
Specific to this bill,
Mhm.
I would encourage you to look at the definitions of each of the types of concerned land and think about opportunities to potentially broaden them a little bit, both to include agricultural land, but also to consider other than permanent conservation. And then I think providing flexibility about how we pursue the 2050 target in particular. I think we're close on achieving 30 by 30 conservation in Vermont, based on current land holdings and sort of things that are already in the works. But the focus on permanent conservation by 2050, I think, is where it starts to drive us to quantity over quality, and would encourage the committee to look for opportunities to emphasize ecological quality.
I missed the third one you said. Broaden for ag, flexibility with the 2050 target. I put full-time person, and then you had one other, and I didn't.
Right.
I'll look. There was
I
one
may have to
other.
go back and look, Senator White.
There were some of the definitions, yeah.
Well, yeah, and that gets at sort of the broadening for flexibility, is the definitions are fairly narrow and tailored right now.
Those all seem like spring training to me.
Yeah.
I mean,
When the season opens, what actions would you have us take?
to properly to provide resources for the work consistent with the goals and vision of the bill, right? We are very thoughtful about the conservation opportunities we pursue, because we are staff limited and we are cash limited, both in the immediate term and in the long term, to steward these resources. And so setting a target, a goal, a slogan, whatever this ends up, how folks would like to refer to it, without additional resources being brought to bear to support that work, we're going to continue to move in the direction of conserving key resources as they're available to us and as resources are available. But our pace can't grow absent a sustainable commitment of resources from this body to this work.
Can I just make one point?
Senator White, last point question to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think you're having difficulty with this committee wanting to properly resource your agency to be able to meet the commitments that you have.
Yes, agreed.
In your memo on the costs related not just to the year, but sort of the program where to roll out, based on your experience, maybe you could say something just educational for this committee about stewardship costs, because it's my impression that they're so often underestimated, and the legislature sometimes is a challenge with one-time commitments versus ongoing commitments.
And I think Becca can probably speak to that too. I mean, what ends up happening is a lot of our stewardship work ends up being delayed. And so the more land that we have responsibility for stewarding, sort of the longer amount of time that'll elapse before we come back to the place where we started our work. And so it's not sort of a presence absence conversation. It's maybe we should be doing this work every 5 years or 10 years, whether it's long range management planning, timber harvesting, improvements to recreational assets, what have you. And instead of getting in there every 5 or 10 years, now we're in there every 10 or 15 years as a result of just not having what are the resources that would be needed to meet our ideal cadence.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
That like to invite Becca Washburn and Ms. Washburn and Mr. Austin, and you can do this as tag team wrestling, you know, like two chairs at the head of the table or.
Arm wrestle?
I don't know. I know what I mean.
Thanks, Julie.
So,
Just need to get some
I have
slides.
Yeah,
okay,
I'm supposed to be the tech expert here.
You want me to grab that chair?
Oh. So if I share screen, I haven't had to share a presentation before. If there's any,
You go to share screen.
do my share screen and then just bring up the PowerPoint.
Mhm.
Okay, lovely. We're slaves to Teams up at National Life, so I don't have a lot of experience here. So,
Yeah, so you're just gonna wanna do slideshow view show. So up in this corner here. Oh, there you got it.
Well,
Okay, I'll slow you.
good morning, and I have, you know, we've asked plenty of questions, and I'm guessing we're gonna have more, if I know we'll have more. If we can be on pace to go through your presentation, is 10 to 15 minutes gonna work, or is that gonna be
I
at a full gallop?
am going to attempt to be uncharacteristically brief.
Okay,
So I'm gonna try to make up time for you. I'll give it my best shot here.
okay, thank you.
Good morning. For the record, my name is John Austin, and I am the Lands and Habitat Program Manager with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I oversee the department's interests in all things related to land conservation, management, habitat protection. I've been doing this work for nearly 30 years with the department, believe it or not, despite my youthful appearance. I'm delighted to talk with you this morning about H-126. My testimony this morning will provide you with the background regarding the agency's efforts to support land and habitat conservation and management through non-fee acquisition programs. My colleague Becca Washburn will speak to the agency's efforts, real estate efforts in actual land acquisition. Hopefully this information provides useful perspective on the scope of conservation opportunities that exists as you consider how H-126 can advance an ambitious and realistic land conservation plan for Vermont. Related to the interests of H-126, and I think also getting at some of the good questions that you asked Secretary Moore, are the agency's responsibilities for land and biodiversity conservation. The agency's responsibilities are broad and significant. We are responsible for the public's interests in air quality, water quality, forest health, the overall health and integrity of our environment, and the myriad of species of plants and animals that depend on our landscapes, in addition to all the related public interests associated with Vermont's rich environment. So having a complex set of responsibilities, we are constantly adapting and growing our abilities to effectively
Is that
deal with that.
Sorry, I was gonna ask if that was a mink on the bottom.
It is a mix.
I just saw one in Middlebury
Oh, great.
on the riverbank. Never know where. Gonna see,
Don't get
could be
too
on Main
close.
Street, could be on the river.
I know. They tend to not like to be around people, so I'm always surprised when you see one scurrying down the banks of the Winooski River in the middle of Montpelier. In considering strategic land conservation, it's important to look at Vermont from a regional perspective. These two maps show the results of some scientific modeling efforts that depict what we know to be the connected landscape of what we refer to as the Appalachian-Acadian ecoregion, or more generally, the Atlantic seaboard. The map on the left reflects the Nature Conservancy's resilient and connected land network and illustrates how ecosystems from Florida to Maine are interconnected and ecologically interact with one another. And the map on the right highlights several important ecological connections within the Northeast region identified by the Staying Connected Partnership, which I'll speak to in just a few moments. We use this kind of information to guide decisions about land acquisition, as well as where and how to provide technical and financial assistance to private landowners. It also highlights Vermont as being at the crossroads for ecological connectivity for the region, and why conserving key parts of the Vermont landscape is so important for the health of the environment. When you think about Vermont and our role and where we fit into the larger ecologically connected landscape, consider the wood turtle and the woodland caribou. Our job is to maintain the connected landscape from Rhode Island to northern Quebec, to ensure that these species and all the other plants and animals in this region and the ecological systems that they rely upon remain healthy and intact. Closer to home, I'll share an anecdotal story with you. I promise I'm going to keep this brisk. We've been engaged in a moose research project where we have moose collared with GPS radio telemetry instruments around their necks. And this study is looking at moose behavior, habitat selection, and mortality and survival. Anecdotally, one of the collared moose that we had was up in Bloomfield, in the very northeast corner of the state, decided not too long ago to make a foray down the Spine of the Worcester Range and over into Fenn Basin in the town of Basin. The moose did that within the matter of 3 or 4 days. It hung out in Fenn Basin for a while and then decided it liked it better up in Bloomfield and decided to return there. And I don't understand why the moose did this. It ended up crossing the Connecticut River into the state of New Hampshire. Why a moose in the great state of Vermont would go to New Hampshire is beyond me.
To get to the other side.
But it's New Hampshire.
No sales.
Does it have a partner? Like, what's the?
I don't, who knows what was driving this decision, but the point is, maintaining the connections, the ecological connections across the Vermont landscape is essential for lots of important reasons, including for wildlife to move around, find mates, access food and other important habitats. And
It's a
to
long
adjust,
way, Bloomfield facing.
Yeah.
it is a very long
2
way.
or 3 days.
Yeah, it's a very long way.
Long.
Yeah, remarkable. That sort of information, as I said, is used routinely to guide our decisions about all sorts of conservation actions. I find this slide helpful in understanding why we're able to have a conversation today about progressive land conservation in Vermont. It's no mistake that 22% of the Vermont landscape is already in some form of permanent conservation. It's no mistake that we have Vermont Conservation Design as a science-based piece of information to guide our conservation efforts. 30 years ago, we recognized the importance of maintaining the connected landscape and began protecting wildlife travel corridors through the Act 250 process. We've used our knowledge of wildlife corridors to target land acquisition efforts in places like Okemo State Forest, Coolidge State Forest, and many others. We've enjoyed the benefits of the Forest Legacy Program from its inception, which was inspired by, among others, Senator Leahy, and Vermont is a leader in the nation for using that program to fund extensive land conservation. We've studied the movements and behavior of black bears, bobcats, moose, and many other species of wildlife to inform our conservation efforts. We've developed comprehensive plans that you were speaking to earlier, the Vermont Wildlife Action Plan, the Forest Action Plan, to name a few. And we've created Vermont Conservation Design as a tool to understand the connected, ecologically connected landscape of Vermont. My point is, Vermont has been exceptionally progressive in our approach to thoughtful land and water conservation, and we have a firm foundation to grow and improve our programs, which I think is just an important piece of background perspective as you consider the implications of H1 26.
You mentioned habitat connectors and forest land and Act 250, which I think is an area this committee has been frustrated in
Yes.
codifying this active criteria. I think only forest soils are mentioned currently.
Well, I appreciate that. I've spent a lot of time working with the Act 250 world, and I see great value in it. So I'm going to speak to that in a little more detail in just a moment.
Now you're pandering.
No. So here's the meat of what I wanted to share. These are some of the types of conservation programs that are complementary, I would suggest, to our land acquisition efforts. So we have technical assistance with private landowners. This comes in the form of our support of, for instance, federal farm bill conservation programs. The agency and other partners spend a lot of time working with our federal colleagues to help deliver those to private landowners. There are the opportunities for habitat protection efforts through Act 50, Section 248, and other regulatory mechanisms. I'll get into these in more detail in a sec. We spend a lot of time working with communities around the state in partnership with our colleagues at the NRC and others to help raise community awareness and appreciation for conservation and how to bake that into town plans. And all of this happens with a lot of partners, which I'll make a point to in just a little bit. Make sure I don't miss something. Vermont's flagship conservation program, the Use Value Appraisal Program, is arguably the most successful conservation program aimed at private landowners in Vermont. As you know, there are two elements to this program, one aimed at the conservation of agricultural land and the other at forest land. And here I'm talking about the forest land component of use value appraisal, where we have over 2 million acres of private forest land currently enrolled in that program. Not only is that a remarkable conservation achievement that is having such a large portion of Vermont's private land being thoughtfully managed for healthy forests, but it represents a large audience of willing landowners who are interested in doing good things for their land and not developing and subdividing.
What's UVA?
The Use Value Appraisal Program. That's tax incentive program, property tax incentive program. Benefits of working
Current
with
use. Yeah, it's current use.
current use, yes. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
current use, yeah. The benefits of working with so many private landowners and such a large area of private land are innumerable and afford the agency and our partners opportunities to guide and inform good land stewardship based on best available science and management strategies. Our department supports our Forest and Parks colleagues with things like enrollment of land in use value appraisal programs, ecologically sensitive treatment areas, as well as now there's a new provision, which, as you know, for enrolling land in use value appraisal program for old forests. All three departments in the agency work with our federal colleagues in the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service to help deliver the benefits of federal Farm Bill conservation programs. Like UVA, these programs provide technical and financial support to private landowners to do good things for fish, wildlife, water quality, and healthy forests. We work with hundreds of landowners each year and influence thousands of acres of private land. Some specific programs are aimed at improving habitat for golden-winged warblers, wood turtles, restoring floodplain habitats, and restoring wetlands and aquatic habitats. The agency, working with partners like my good colleague, Mr. Fidel at the Vermont Natural Resources Council, supports municipal and regional planning commissions to incorporate wildlife, forest, water quality, and conservation interests and issues into town plans and local zoning bylaws. These are important opportunities to build awareness and appreciation for conservation and how the decisions of local landowners and communities can benefit Vermont's healthy environment. Thanks to our partnership with VNRC, we've seen significant improvement for how towns and more strategically planning for community conservation interests. This is also an opportunity to build support for public ownership of land because, as you know, the state as a policy does not acquire interests in land in communities that don't support the project. We also spend a lot of time working in the regulatory process. I've spent a lot of my career doing this. Our work in regulatory processes such as Act 250 is important for the conservation of fish and wildlife habitat, water quality, and healthy forests, while not necessarily the sort of proactive conservation approach envisioned by H126. This is another important conservation tool that needs to be considered in the context of strategic conservation planning. Some of the outcomes of our efforts in the regulatory process result in permanent land conservation through implementation of easements. Our role in these processes also enables us to educate the regulated community about parts of the Vermont landscape that are especially critical for conservation, thereby advancing conservation plans. I'm going to skip past this one in the interest of time. There we go. Whoops, no, too far, sorry. Okay. All of this work requires the skills, expertise, and resources from many different partners. The agency could not fulfill its broad mission without the support and collaboration of lots of different government and non-government organizations. One of the benefits of doing conservation work in a small state like Vermont is that we have a fairly tight-knit community of conservation organizations that knows how to collaborate and work together to achieve something greater than what any one organization is capable of on their own. H126 envisions this sort of collaboration, which is wise. But the good news is it already happens. This is perhaps best reflected by the Staying Connected Initiative, which is a regional, multi-state, multinational partnership of government and non-government organizations, all working together to understand and conserve the connected landscape of the region. I actually believe I spoke with this committee last year with a colleague from the Vermont Agency of Transportation about our work between the two agencies, looking at portions of state roads where we're trying to improve fish and wildlife passage under and over those roads, both for public safety as well as for the benefit of our fish and wildlife. So I won't dwell on this one, but I just threw it in here to reflect. This is another illustration of how this collaboration for land conservation happens. Again, if you're going to conserve land on both sides of the road, you want to make sure that somehow you maintain some sort of ecological connection. Otherwise, you end up with stranded investments. All right, I'm almost done with it.
Stranded investments being animals being hit by vehicles.
Well, maybe my stranded infrastructure isn't the best analogy, but what I was referring to is if the land that you're looking to conserve is on one side of the road, but in fact there's the need to have it connected to other things on a different side of the road, then you need to be looking on both sides of the road to make a good decision.
Okay, so it's less, okay.
Today, we have Vermont conservation design and other useful science and information to inform thoughtful and effective conservation decisions. I appreciate that H126 specifically references and draws upon Vermont conservation design as an important guide for how to achieve conservation success in the future. Setting aside the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 goals, our real goal is this: maintaining the ecologically functional and connected landscape that is reflected here. We've made great progress in that regard already, and the agency and many conservation partners are already using Vermont conservation design to guide conservation programs and decisions for things like land acquisition, which is my segue to my colleague, Ms. Walker.
Thank you. Question, so Senator.
What is the map on the left?
The map on your left, that is Vermont conservation design. So that is like the first two maps that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. This reflects an assessment of all sorts of ecological data that we have available, from natural communities to forest blocks to streams, rivers, lakes, ponds, wetlands, locations of rare species, and unique geological features. All sorts of ecological information went into coming up with how do you identify those portions of the Vermont landscape that are most critical for maintaining ecological function long term.
So that's land we would like to conserve.
Correct. The green, and it's not to diminish the value of what's not green. I've never seen a piece of land I didn't think was important. To be fair,
Quantity.
so- but I think it represents roughly 66, 67% of the landscape. So that's what's essential to maintain ecological function.
Thank you.
Go on.
Thank you. Ms. Washburn, I'd like to join us. And we are running long, and that's okay. We will, I don't want to, but if you can, do you have a sense of how much time it is?
I will be brief,
Okay,
without giving short shrift to, I think, a very important topic.
sure.
For the record, my name is Rebecca Washburn. I'm the Director of Lands Administration and Recreation with the Forest Parks and Recreation Department. And I'm really pleased to be here today. And my focus really is going to be on giving as much of the nuts and bolts of permanent land protection. My colleague, Mr. Austin, providing you with a range of the programs that are occurring around the state that I think represent that conservation pathway or that conservation ladder that you were referencing in your questions of Secretary Moore. All of that work has the potential to build towards permanent conservation, or in other situations where a landowner might not be in a position or have an interest in permanent conservation, these are other tools by which we can seek those same natural resource benefits. So that conservation ladder is intended to pursue that vision of ecological connectivity and function without having to always use permanent conservation as the tool. So with that, I think what I'd like to do very quickly, the 30 by 30 bill that you referenced early, America the Beautiful, just want to call your attention to the last bullet. I think this is the place where the Biden administration was thinking about that very need for flexibility of meeting landowners where they're at, meeting their interests, and wanting to emphasize that a range of different types of tools, the flexibility at the local level really can achieve that quality vision that the secretary did such a great job of illustrating in her remarks earlier. So I just call your attention to the different guiding principles in that executive order, and most particularly that one that I believe is consistent with the recommendations the agency's been making. With permanent conservation, what I'd like to use to characterize the success factors that go into permanent conservation. We've talked a lot through the range of testimony that your committee and other committees have heard in the context of this bill, that it takes willing landowners to do permanent conservation. And the way I like to talk about the sort of the time horizon of locating willing landowners in the places where you want to do strategic conservation is you measure it in the number of cups of coffee that you have at the table with that landowner. Some projects take a lot of cups of coffee. And at the end of the day, the willing landowner drives where you get to do land conservation because of the way those programs are set up. Conservation organizations, similarly, a really critical factor in permanent conservation. These organizations are durable. They're around for the long haul. They follow standards and practices that ensure the highest quality conservation work. They have staff with the expertise to do this work day in and day out, and have the resources to take on that perpetual obligation of permanent conservation. The strategic conservation plan is another piece, one that we've been emphasizing a lot through this bill. The idea of a plan being used to really help to strategically, precisely invest your resources. Funding, I think it's obvious and goes without saying that the more flexible, reliable, accessible, and plentiful that funding is, the better our strategic conservation work is going to be. Having funding that allows a conservation organization to consider the important resource values and the best tools to use to protect those feels like an ingredient that requires highlighting. And then again, stewardship, again, another question of Secretary Moore earlier, the cost of stewardship, one that this plan would investigate and better help to articulate what that ongoing cost is. But regardless of whether you're looking at fee land ownership, owning, all of the bundle of sticks, or if you're looking at a conservation easement, there are perpetual stewardship obligations that go along with that responsibility. I thought it worth it to take a moment to emphasize that even in permanent conservation, there are different routes by which you can achieve that goal of permanent conservation. I referenced fee acquisition a moment ago and a bundle of sticks. This is how we reference the different legal rights that make up fee ownership. This is the highest value. It costs the most, but it gives you the most management authority and responsibilities. And again, the most ownership responsibilities. The 360,000 acres that the agency owns and manages comes with those responsibilities and that perpetual obligation. But at the same time, we have full control and authority through the work that we do and the statutes that inform how we carry out our mission to be able to do that work. Conservation easements acquire certain sticks, most commonly known public access and development rights. Less value, these typically cost less, and your management authority is really commensurate with the sticks that you're acquiring, and again, comes with stewardship obligations. And one point I think is really helpful to make here is that those conservation values present on the property, really the specific parcel, the specific site, the specific landowner conditions, really help to inform whether you're going to acquire a conservation easement or fee ownership. And I will breeze through a couple of examples to illustrate that. Before doing so, I don't know if there are specific questions about the sort of nuts and bolts of land conservation, or if you'd like me to just jump right into ownership and management.
Oh, let's keep going, please.
Great. Secretary Moore mentioned our ownership. What I'd like to emphasize is the evaluation criteria and the processes we use to make good decisions, ecological values, public access, the different management opportunities and values associated with that potential parcel are all important components, of course. Funding that may or may not be available for this conservation work and the partners involved. These are all criteria that our technical experts at the district level that know these lands best are using to determine whether a conservation project is worthy of state ownership or more appropriate for a partner to consider a pursuit of. So again, just emphasizing how we evaluate that quality component that Secretary Moore referenced. Here are the examples I wanted to illustrate. Alberg Bluffs, this is a project that the state closed on close to the end of last year. You can see from the characteristics of this particular property, 16 natural communities and 25 rare endangered species on 164 acres. That's just astounding. It's really, really phenomenal that after 15 plus years, again, speaking to that time horizon that permanent conservation sometimes requires, it took 15 years, but we were at the table as soon as that landowner was interested in doing this project. And we wouldn't have been successful with the partnerships, including the Nature Conservancy and the Vermont Housing Conservation Board. We all decided that FPR ownership made the most sense. We're talking about an addition to the state park and all of the different natural resources that our sister departments in the agency are equipped to conserve best. Champion Lands, totally different setting, different part of the state, 132,000 acres. The conservation values we were pursuing in this instance were working forest, ecological protections, and public access. And we ended up looking at a portfolio of outcomes that resulted in multiple ownerships because there were lots of different conservation values that were seeking to be protected, the conditions in the Northeast Kingdom at the time. All of those factors really influenced what ended up being a very different outcome than something like Alberg Bluffs, where it was clear that state ownership made the most sense. And I apologize, I'm going really fast with this. I wish I could provide in more detail. John, this is one that Fish and Wildlife pursued, and I just will highlight that this is a wetland restoration project, so very different from the other two examples, and one in which we're looking at a different kind of conservation effort that had a farm property that we were able to do some restoration work around in the context of this wetland. And I might have got some of the details wrong, but keep going. Again, ownership and management, this is shifting from the land acquisition side to the work that we do to make sure that we're upholding the conservation values that the public has entrusted us with. I made a couple of notes based on the question that you were asking earlier. And I think long-range management plans, you're asking about like, what does it look like for us to not have the capacity to grow and expand state ownership without being mindful of the costs that are associated with it. Our long-range management plans, we have 360,000 acres of that. I would say about half has an effective, active long-range management plan. That percentage would look a lot different if we had the capacity to be able to do more planning. Our pipeline of management activities, each year we solicit input from our state land staff on what are the projects they'd like to put on the ground, whether they're roads projects, trails projects, the whole range of different types of management responsibilities we have for different properties. It might be invasives control or habitat improvements. And on an annual basis, we have about $10 million worth of projects that we could fund. And we have generally less than $1 million to put towards that work. So that's just on an annual basis, the example of the types of work that we could be doing with the resources if we have them. Key takeaways here, again, I feel like I breezed right through this and I apologize. I would have loved to have spent more time sharing some of the nuances of what I think is so important about the distinction between permanent land protection and the other tools that help landowners where they're at. But I think the different land uses and different land ownership is really important and key to hammer home emphasizing and reinforcing what Secretary Moore said earlier, that if ecological function connected landscape is the goal, then being thoughtful about how to meet people where they're at based on those different land uses and land ownership types that are occurring across the state that we want to occur across the state, business owners, private landowners, large landowners, small landowners. And permanent land protection is an important tool here, but it's not the only tool. And it requires those key success factors in order for it to be effective, durable, and really meeting those conservation goals that conservation work would have. And then again, not all land is equal. Vermont Conservation Design is a really helpful tool to help us understand if we want to invest that money in 100 acres somewhere where the values are lesser than 100 acres somewhere else, just as Julie, Secretary Moore described, we want to put those investments, that money that we have available for permanent land protection in the best place possible. Not every acre of land in Vermont is equal when it's measured against that quality. So that's it for me. Hopefully, I went fast enough.
Okay,
If
no,
there-
it's fine, and if you feel like you're rushing, that's fine. We're trying to stay at 20,000 feet because we'll come to a lower altitude when we need to, but
Absolutely.
in order to cover enough land, we're gonna try to stay at a higher level. So thanks so much for your presentation. Thanks. With that, let's move right on to Mr. Mears. Welcome back to Senate Natural.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks for having me today. Thanks for being patient with my calendar. I was fortunate or unfortunate to land in several parts of testimony today. Jamie, have you testified yet? So I guess let me start out by saying that the Audubon Vermont is part of coalitions of environmental groups. The Forest Partnership is one. Jamie Fidel will be speaking and testifying on behalf of the Forest Partnership. We're also part of the Water Caucus, and Lauren Bose will be testifying, speaking to the water issues. So we're in support of both of the positions of those.
Sorry, can you introduce yourself for the record?
David Mears, Audubon Vermont, Executive Director. Thank you. I should know that by now. It's like pushing the unmute button. So with that, I think what I'll do is just share a couple of observations specific to Audubon Vermont and our perspective on the importance of how this work happens. First of all, strongly supportive of the bill. Strongly supportive of it as it came out of the House. Think it could be improved. Having heard, I didn't hear all the testimony from the agency this morning, but I heard Secretary Moore's perspective and have spoken with her previously and share the perspective that it's important in this planning effort to consider the broad scope of tools that are available. And I'll give an example. Audubon Vermont does not do the work of permanent land conservation. We work with the land trusts, we work with the state and federal landowners in order to make sure that they're managing their land in ways that are good for biological diversity and habitat. We have a particular focus on Audubon Vermont, of course, on birds, but it turns out when you take care of the birds, you take care of just about everything else as well. And so as we do our work, though, we do much more work in the restoration arena. And when you're doing restoration work, ideally, and frankly, this is an area of improvement and opportunity for the environmental community and for the state and for the federal agencies. We have tended to do conservation work in a somewhat ad hoc Swiss cheese kind of approach that is not strategic, not fully considering the broad design, the design characteristics of conservation design. We tend to be opportunistic. If we have a willing landowner that wants to participate in a program, whether it's permanent conservation, or it's to be entering in long-term leases, or they want to be in current use, or they just want technical assistance, we just work with them in that way. Increasingly, there's a consensus among our community that we need to be more strategic. This is a way of thinking about Secretary Moore's point about quality. We need to identify that mix of fens, bogs, swamps, upland, bottomland, forest types, fields, meadows mixed in with early successional habitat and mature forests. We need those mixes. And as we identify the most critical places on the landscape and those places that are part of an important, maybe part of a forest corridor, it may be just in a particularly ecologically sensitive area, the property lines don't line up with those same areas. You may have a mix of different property owners. Imagine a beautiful area, a wetlands complex that's surrounded by fields, supported by upland forest that has headwaters flowing out of older mature forests. If you put a grid of property ownership on that, it's not going to line up that way. It's not going to be one entity. Some of those people are going to want to sell. They just want to be bought out. Some of them are going to be interested in selling their development rights as long as they can continue to farm or manage their forests. Some of them really have no interest in giving up their development rights or selling. They want to maintain it, but they have a deep commitment to the natural values of that land. They just want education, or they may want a tax break, or they may want other incentives. And as this state, as we do this critical work as described in this bill, I do think it makes sense to craft language in it that broadens, that makes sure that the people that are doing the planning work have the permission and encouragement to think about that broad mix of tools, so that we're not unnecessarily constrained to just being looking at a permanent conservation. And honestly, I don't even really understand the concept of permanent in this context, because we're talking about, we want centuries worth of permanence. There's nothing, other than maybe death and taxes, that's truly permanent, as I look at our civilization. So giving permission to think about, sure, we should have long-term durable measures in place, and there should be accountability, but giving the planners and including the agency, the folks that VHCB is convening, the chance and the permission to consider a broad range would be helpful.
Thank you, Chair Bray. I appreciate your testimony. So one of the things that concerns me as someone who appreciates the natural environment is the point I raised earlier around extinction and kind of the loss of species. Do you believe, coming from your organization, that the path and all the tools that we have now are actually going to prevent the predicted species loss that, especially in the bird community, that's a great phrase, is experiencing? Or are we, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I feel like we're failing based on the information I have, but I'm also hearing we're doing great and we're doing better than everybody else. So I'm just wondering if you could help me understand what it means for the actual creatures that we're talking about that you are meant to steward.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. And for context, we are in a biodiversity crisis, and Vermont is part of it. There's been studies that predict we'll lose as many as 2/3 of the birds that are in Vermont due to climate change and climate change related conditions. At the same time, we have this huge opportunity in Vermont. We can do our part on climate change. We're not going to turn that curve ourselves, but we are a critical refugia for a whole bunch of migratory birds that depend upon Vermont's forests and fields and wetlands and riparian areas. So we have an absolute obligation, and we have to transform the way that we live on the landscape. We have done amazing work in Vermont. Some of it is just an accident of being a little bit further away from the city of Boston and being a little bit colder and hillier and less, arable land than other places. But some of it's quite intentional, and it includes not just the tools like the permanent conservation, which is we're incredible in that arena as a state. And it's not just current use, but it's also Act 250 and it's land use regulation. And it's a culture that we have in this state, a culture of conservation and respect for the environment. And we need to, if we're going to drive the kind of transformational change that we need now, we do not have time to wait till 2050, and we do not have time to raise the money to buy half of the state and set it aside for biodiversity. We have to change the way we're living on the land right now. And that means a whole host of tools that we need to use. And that's part of the work that all of the people in this room are engaged in. How do we reach all of the private landowners? 75% of the forest land in the state is privately owned. Unless we hit the state jackpot, we are gonna have to work with that community of people to find ways to help them make a living off their land, pay their taxes, and still benefit from all the biodiversity that they can help provide.
And it seems like that, well, I'll stop asking questions based on time, but I'll ask you some later.
Please continue, Jim.
So look, just two other quick points. One is just in support of what Lauren Oates will be describing later. I do think that there's potential possibility that there's kind of ships passing in the night on the conversation about water. Clearly, as we think about the opportunities to prioritize where we need to protect land, those lands that have a relationship to and are critical to, which can run all the way from the headwaters down through the floodplains and riparian areas, we need to be thinking about how those lands fit into our overall plans for water protection and watershed health. So I'm sure we can figure out language that incorporates the idea that land is related to water into this bill, and I'm a little confused we haven't already done that. And then the last thing is I absolutely, as someone who's been a former public official, agree and respect the Secretary's request for more resources. It does not make sense to ask the agency to do something this profound as coming up with a plan to transform the way we manage the landscape and to do it with existing staff. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you. Any questions? Good to see you again. Mr. Martin.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Trey Martin, for the record. I'm the Director of Conservation and Rural Community Development at VHCB, and I'm just going to open up the Zoom link here so that I can use a couple of slides to illustrate my points today. And while that is coming online,
For anyone who's looking at the agenda and the clock,
Yeah.
we always line people up. There's a break in the line.
your mic off.
it is now.
We're not going to try to get everyone in before 10:30. We'll flow over the line there. So,
I'm not sure that I'll be done by 10:30, but I'll do my best.
okay.
I'm still hoping to share screen, which is disabled.
That's for security purposes.
I understand.
Yeah.
I wouldn't let me anywhere near your. Well, I guess I'll just,
You're all.
There you
oh,
go.
got it, thank you. All right, do you see that okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, well, I guess I'd start off by saying that I'm here on behalf of the HCD and our management team to speak to the committee about H126, a bill that the HCB has supported this year. We supported H606, which passed through this body last year. And the reason why we are providing our support for this is because this bill establishes, as you've heard all morning, these incredibly important goals and an incredibly important vision for how we live on the landscape. It also establishes a really robust process, a process that we've already engaged with our partners and other stakeholders to begin last summer in anticipation of another bill coming and moving through. While there's a lot of scientific expertise that's come into this building to talk about this bill, we really need to hear from landowners, from farmers and foresters and loggers and other stewards of the land, the people who conduct recreation activities on the land, groups that are seeking better access and equity of access to the land. And so what I particularly like and the ACB particularly appreciates about this bill is that it creates the expectation of a 2 to 3 year process that's going to be informed by the public, by those landowners, by the people who work the land, by the indigenous groups and other people who are going to be most affected by climate change and the way that they live on the land. That is critical. It also establishes a long-term strategy, as David Mears spoke to, that we have protected. The HCB has invested over $100 million over the last 35 years with partners to protect about 450,000 acres in conservation, permanent conservation. Our $100 million investment has leveraged another $400 to $500 million of partner investments. And that's roughly 5% of the landscape. We're seeking to increase our investments over the next 5 years to duplicate that effort, to move from 22 or 25% conserved, whether or not you include agricultural lands. It's a gigantic investment that's being called for. Whether or not we're seeking to do all of that by 2050 through permanent conservation or through a blend of tools, we know that we're going to need robust resources. And so this process is going to allow us to both identify what that budget should be for acquisition, for stewardship, for enhancement, for capacity, frankly, not only at the agency, but at VHCB and our partners to steward those resources, but also to strategically spend at the right priority, you know, to prioritize what goes first. Environmental conservation design and the other tools are great at that. Conserved land, farms, forests, fields, working landscapes surrounding compact villages. That is the Vermont brand. It's what we're known for around the region, around the country, and it's frankly, it's embedded in our history. It's embedded in our economy. It's embedded in the way of life that we have here. I can think of nothing more important to do with, you know, my role at VHCB and in the work of our organization and working with all these partners to move this forward. So I'm going to spend a little time today just orienting you to our work by way of talking about our support for the bill. So that first slide was a picture of Bird Mountain Wildlife Management Area in Ira and Poultney, a couple thousand, 3,000 acres maybe. About 1,600 was added in 2013. That's a picture of Equinox Highlands down in southern Vermont, a gigantic tract of northern hardwood forests supporting lots of natural communities, but also supporting recreation, diffuse access recreation, trail-based recreation. It cleans our air, it cleans our water, it takes care of it. There's incredible natural communities there. When we talk about climate resilience, the forested parcels like that on Mount Equinox and Mother Mira are incredibly important. You also see the dual goals of Vermont Housing and Conservation Board there, which is conserving and protecting our lands, our forests, our waters, because those are of primary importance to the economic vitality of the state and to our way of life. Next slide just speaks to the way that we expend our funds at VHCB. We are allocated a portion of the property transfer tax every year, as well as drawing down federal dollars. Some of those we match, some of those are grants that partners match, but a lot of money moves through VHCB every year within the conservation mission. It's sometimes around, $10 to $12 million a year. We're talking about probably tripling, quadrupling, 5x, 6x, 7x of that if we're to achieve the goals of conserving 500,000 more acres in the next 6 years. Just let that sink in. $30-40 million a year is probably the budget. If you had
Billion?
Million.
Okay. 30 to 40 million per year is what you're saying.
Yeah, for 500,000 acres would move us from 25% to 30% of the landscape.
Yes.
And we're spending about $2,000 an acre right now to acquire that land. The housing crisis and the economic pressures and inflation that we're seeing right now is driving up not just the cost of entry into housing, but the cost of purchase for conservation of land and farms. The picture of your region, Senator Bray, in Addison County, those are conserved farmland and natural areas. This speaks, I think, also to the tapestry approach that David was describing, where if we're going to conserve and protect land, we need to acknowledge the full use of that set of tools, because look at all of the landowners, look at all of the parcels. Look at if you want to connect from the receiving water of Lake Champlain through Addison County to the Green Mountains, you're going to be dealing with dozens, maybe hundreds of landowners. And as David said, not all of those landowners are ready for permanent conservation or sale of that land. Some of them need to move up the conservation ladder. They need to begin with education. They need to begin with technical assistance, maybe move through current use or other programs towards that more permanent conservation. It's going to take time and education and resources beyond what we've really contemplated in the past for this effort. Waters. VHCB does a lot of work around the protection of waters. We're the clean water service provider for the Memphremagog Basin, but we also invest state bond dollars every year to protect water quality through investments on farms, through investments on working forests. And again, as a nod to the Nature Conservancy and Ms. Oates, who's going to speak later, a really important part of our strategy, the conservation design strategy, is identifying how to conserve along riparian corridors, along river corridors, around lakes and ponds, so that the way that species move is part of the fabric of the investments that we're making. Lastly, a program that VHCD operates is speaking to David's point about needing to make sure landowners can continue to live on their land, pay their taxes, not have to sell off portions of it in order to pay those taxes, is supporting the rural enterprises that we operate. So we have a farm and forest viability program where we invest a couple $1 million a year to leverage far bigger returns for rural landowners. We also help rural communities and agricultural operations to draw down grant funding from federal and regional grants so that they can invest in rural enterprise. The return on investment is gigantic from that. From a state fiscal kind of management or a budgetary perspective, the return on investment for our landscape is much more important, because when we allow those operations to be successful, or when we support those operations to be successful, we're supporting keeping that land unconverted, undeveloped, still in forest, still in farm, or in the blend that Secretary Morse talked about when she was testifying about agricultural lands. It's something that's so important to me, and something I would really want to leave you with, is the notion that when we conserve a working farm, when VHCD works with the Land Trust or the Upper Valley Land Trust or the Stowe Land Trust, some of our partners who do agricultural conservation, we're often looking at parcels that are up to half wooded, that have wetland complexes, riparian corridors, and when we protect it, we do a lot more than just incorporate by reference the regulatory requirements. We go way beyond those requirements to permanently protect those waters and the lands adjacent to them. So what we did last year, after H606 was vetoed by the governor, is we sat down with the agency, we sat down with our land trust partners, we sat down with others and said, this work is still important, right? Right. Universal agreement from the staff, the Secretary of A&R, the Land Trust, that we wanted to continue to develop a planning process. Whether or not a bill was going to be introduced this year, whether or not a bill would pass, VHCD set aside funding and capacity to lead an effort of those partners to create a process that would engage the public around long-term permanent strategic conservation and land protection. You see the bolded language at the bottom. That's the language that Secretary Moore used. That's the language that John and Becca referred to, that David referred to. We're talking about function. We're talking about connection. We're talking about quality. We're talking about a landscape that works for the species that Senator White, that you're asking about. It has to work for the species, which means the connection, not stranding the investment on one side of the road because there's no passage to the other side of the road. We've engaged already those land trust partners, but over the next couple of years, that set of bullets in the bottom of the slide there is the many, many different groups, from landowners, loggers, and farmers, to groups interested in equity of access, to policy advocacy organizations, to recreation enthusiasts. We will be engaging them. We'll be engaging them in large public meetings. We'll be engaging them in focus groups. We are going to be doing this and bringing back with an inventory to you, like the bill describes in section 2803. And we're going to be bringing, after that, a plan for the next 30 years of investments in Vermont. We will also be bringing you a budget for acquisition, and a budget for the stewardship and capacity needed to take care of those lands that they require. So that's that. Phase one in the bill is section 2803. That's developing a baseline. We have, even as John and I were whispering on the sideline today, you'll hear some different numbers about what have we currently protected. We need a Rosetta Stone. We need to translate the work of all the different organizations that protect and hold conserved land, and to be able to tell you, where are we now? How much did it cost to get here? What are the carrying costs? What are the stewardship costs? So that we have the data to inform the, how do we get from 22% or 26% to 30% and then to 50% over time, and what tools and strategies will be needed. And then once we have that baseline, we'll be able to sit down, we'll broaden even further to hear from more people about what the strategies should be to get from now to 2030 and from now to 2050? What's the priority and hierarchy of investments through conservation design, through the different tools that are also referred to in the bill? There's the tools listed for you. So they're in the bill. You alluded to them earlier. I won't take much more time on that. But end with this wonderful picture of taken by Heather Furman at the Nature Conservancy of a parcel up in the Northeast Kingdom that represents about a 30-year process to conserve. This land was sought to be acquired for protection in the 1980s and early 1990s. A landowner sold it to, I think it was a couple from New Jersey, who had no interest in doing much with the land, and finally, worked with us and with the Nature Conservancy to conserve it about 5 years ago. It's why the story has to be a story about flexibility and about meeting landowners where they are, because it sometimes takes 3 decades to get that land into permanent protection. But because there was a lot of support, there's a lot of education, there's that history, that culture, that ethos of land stewardship in Vermont, it remained unconverted during that time. And so when the time was right for protection, we were able to make the investment to bring it into permanent conservation.
Thank you. What is the role to date in municipalities participating in this kind of work? How major a player are they, or are they not, in terms of looking at, for instance, conserving an area or town forest, or a river goes through your town? Someone says we should be planning on keeping that river clean or healthy or whatever.
Well, a couple different programs that you're thinking about there. So first thinking about town forests and urban and community forests. There's a whole program in the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation that now Commissioner Fisco was the head of. She could speak with a lot more specific numbers than I can, but VHCB and the agency and partners, we work with communities to conserve municipal forests wherever there are willing communities who want to do that. That's some of the best, when you think about the suite of different conservation outcomes where you get, habitat and biodiversity protection, you have recreation opportunities, you're protecting your watershed, you're protecting air, you're giving the health benefits and the community meeting benefits of having a protected place. We have several projects that will be coming to the board over the next 15 months where we'll be working with communities to do that. And then in terms of protecting watersheds, I think that's a more community by community approach. If they're going to do more than comply with road permit requirements or comply with other MS4 or other regulatory requirements, but the value of that is tremendous. When Irene hit and we predicted based on the water flow through the Otter Creek what was going to happen to downtown Middlebury, it was going to be wiped out. But there was a set of conservation projects that had happened upstream that had protected wetland complexes and floodplains and restored those, and the water rose, sort of at a manageable trajectory, and then it receded, and downtown Middlebury wasn't hit. So this is why in the town planning requirements and the regional planning requirements, they're planning for conservation, planning for the protection of those resources is a key element. And it's a reason why the regional planners and planners more generally would be part of the outreach that we do to say, what do you need in terms of resources to help towns be ready?
Great, well, thanks, Fred. I think that the number I saw was that Middlebury had avoided something in the neighborhood of $3 million worth of damage by virtue of that vast floodplain south into Salisbury.
Yeah.
All the rest. Yeah. Great. Any questions for Mr. Martin? Fairway.
Great question.
Mr.
And then I think Sarah McCormick has a question. Where do you stand on the bill?
At the beginning, we enthusiastically support the bill. There are 3 changes in sections 2803 and 2804 that I would recommend to your attention.
And that's
I also,
testimony.
I will hand that out as I finish up. Those planning sections right now say the Secretary of A&R with support from VHCB shall do X, Y, and Z. We've spoken to the agency. We've talked about the role we're playing, the role that they would like to play, and we recommend to you to revise that to say the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, in consultation with the Secretary, shall. I also recommend that there are changes being recommended by the agency around capacity, around the 2050 goals. There are changes that are being recommended by the Forest Partnership and by the Nature Conservancy. And that, to Senator McDonald's question, what would you have us do? I would have you ask us to work together to bring a set of changes that we can all live with to this committee to rationalize how is capacity going to be built at ANR, how's it going to be built at PHCB, how are we going to support the process, how are we going to address the need for flexibility, how are we going to address the reality, which is that VHCB has already invested a lot of time and money in convening stakeholders, sort of the steering level stakeholders to date, and it will be investing a lot more of the money that you've entrusted in us to convene folks over the next couple of years. So those are the things I would have you do. I think others have more specifics than I have right now.
Sure, great.
Wonderful.
Well, so a couple things. We'll take a break for 10 minutes, but, sorry, Senator, well, let me finish this and then we'll go to Senator McCormick. So you have, for anyone who has slide decks today, if you could please email them to Jude and she can put them up on our website, so people who want to look at the stuff off remotely will have access to the same materials we have. The other thing is you mentioned the idea of collaborative work. So my hope is that we'll come back to this before wrapping for the day, to create a working process. We just did this on the anti-degradation bill. There were a group of stakeholders that worked outside the committee and came back with consensus recommendations or near consensus recommendations. Given the tightness of the schedule, namely 12 days left this session for this committee, we want to be timely, but we can't do all that work in committee. So it would be helpful if stakeholders can collaborate and come back with recommendations. We can talk more about process before we finish for the day. But thanks for teeing that up. So let's take a break till, Senator McCormick. I'm not used to looking at the screen.
Yeah, well, it looks like we're pressed for time, so, but just, in fact, I don't need an answer right now, but this is an issue that I'd like us to keep in mind as we continue this discussion. And it's that besides the general public good and besides future generations, we always have to deal with the neighbors, with the local population. And some mention was made of the Champion lands. And 20 years ago, there was a near rebellion in the Northeast Kingdom that the awful state was taking the Champion lands away from the people. It seemed to me that we not only provided a benefit to everyone, but in particular, a benefit to the folks in the Northeast Kingdom. I'm wondering, what is the attitude up there now? Are they just enjoying the land we preserved for their benefit, or are they still complaining that we took away their property rights or something?
Well, Mr. Austin is volunteering to take a whack at this one.
I might regret that, but Senator McCormick, I have the great privilege of continuing to live through that part of our history with land conservation. And I deal with the town of Brunswick on a regular basis. I guess I would say after 20 plus years, the attitudes of those who found that whole arrangement very objectionable has softened greatly. But that has required constant attention on our part and the part of the Nature Conservancy and the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and the Vermont Land Trust, all of the partners that were part of that miraculous land conservation deal. It's been relationship restoration for 20 plus years, to where I think we are now at a much better place than we were before. But I can't go to a Brunswick Select Board meeting and not, stand there and have everybody kick my shins for good measure. And I don't think we would ever get that town to support any additional public land ownership anytime in the near future. So that highlights my earlier point in the presentation that building community support and appreciation for this kind of work is absolutely essential, and it takes time. It's like water dripping on a stone.
That's the point I would love to leave you with. which is that we don't want to go into this process making a number of decisions and then later have to do relationship restoration and trust restoration. We want, what's good about this bill, why one reason BHCB enthusiastically supports this, is that it requires us to do that work upfront. Not everybody will agree with the plan that comes out, but they will have been heard. They will have opportunity to come to meetings. They will be opportunity to join focus groups. They will have opportunity to make recommendations. And then we will try to make a plan that is conscious of that long history of stewardship and that ethos of land protection in the state.
Well, I
Right.
think the locals down my way would love to see extensive preservation in the Chattagee, Town area. It's another